Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. Recently, the 18th annual Imams conference, organized by AMJA, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists in America, convened. The conference was centered on Shareeah rulings for contemporary issues related to technology and technological advancements. The following is a brief summary of the conclusions regarding technology and acts of worship. As technology continues to advance, of course, it brings about new challenges to navigate. In particular, there are many questions as to how technology can be used in acts of worship. So first of all, the electronic mushaf, which is a Quran appearing on a device or on a phone, for example, is not the same as the mushaf or the Quran as a book between two covers, and it doesn't take the same rulings. Touching the screen is not like touching the actual mushaf. Therefore, there's no harm if a person who's in a state of impurity, minor or major, in a state of janaba, for example, or a woman on her menses or postpartum bleeding, touches a screen or a device while the Quran appears on it. There's no harm in doing that. Secondly, when it comes to the electronic mushaf for prayer, it's generally preferred not to use them, especially during obligatory prayers. However, if there's a need to use them, such as a need for recitation, then there's no harm in doing so. In that case, it would be acceptable for an imam to read from a printed or electronic mushaf, and for the followers praying behind the imam to do the same, if necessary, to correct the imam. This should only be done when there's a genuine need to do so. Also, for non-Arabic speakers who cannot understand the Quranic text, it might be necessary to use a written translation of the Quran. But doing so has to be limited to looking at the translation or pondering over the translation while not pronouncing the words out loud. This allowability is intended to help maintain the concentration and the humility during prayer. Furthermore, in today's world, people tend to carry their smartphones and their tablets everywhere they go, even inside of the bathrooms. Some ask if it's permissible to enter the bathroom with a device that has an app containing Quranic text. The answer is that there's nothing wrong with doing so, and it's not, again, considered an actual mushaf or Quran, especially when the device is turned off. Then there's no harm in doing that. However, one should avoid turning on the device with the words of Allah, with the Quran appearing on the screen while in the bathroom. The next topic regards changes that technology has brought about in the way that Muslims attend and participate in Friday prayers. First of all, it's permissible to use devices to instantaneously translate the khutbah for those who don't understand Arabic. Similarly, it's allowed to use earbuds to listen to the translation of verses recited during Taraweeh, or to listen to the translation of the khutbah for non-Arabic speakers. This is not considered a type of meaningless activity that's prohibited during the prayer or while listening to the khutbah. Secondly, the deaf and hard of hearing are required to fulfill whatever acts of worship they're capable of, and the Friday prayer is required upon them as they are of sound mind. Providing interpreters for the deaf and hard of hearing could reach the level of obligation if those in authority are able to provide that. The interpreters should remain at a distance from the khatib and from the worshippers so as not to cause any distraction. Thirdly, it's not valid to follow a congregational prayer or Friday prayer, for example, from a distance using a broadcast and to follow along with the prayer. This is not permissible. Additionally, it's not permissible to perform the prayer behind a hologram of an imam or to use a hologram to give the Friday khutbah. Now, there's no harm in using holograms for educational purposes, such as listening to a recitation of the Quran or listening to a previous khutbah for the sake of benefit, but the person should not follow along with the prayer, just as it's not permissible to follow a prayer while listening to the audio or watching a video recording. Similarly, a hologram that takes the form of a sound and sound that takes the form and sound of a person cannot be used to fulfill communal obligations, such as calling the adhan. There's no harm in playing it, but it cannot take the place of the actual adhan being called. With regards to using a mihrab or electronic device to determine the qibla, then there's no harm in doing that. Just as the sun, the moon, the stars are used, an electronic device can be used to determine the qibla. It's also permissible to use instruments like binoculars or telescopes to observe the moon and confirm that the beginning or end of the lunar month. It is permissible to use these devices to determine the beginning and end of Ramadan, for example, and other months. Next comes the use of filming or photographing oneself during acts of worship, such as Hajj or Eid prayers, for example. Now, doing so is generally permissible with a few conditions. First of all, if it's done with the intention of teaching or guiding and advising, or bringing joy to loved ones while one is on a trip to Hajj or Umrah, then this is allowed. There's no restriction as long as the person is not showing off. And it's important to avoid invading the privacy of other people while using cameras, and while always being mindful not to display any body parts that should be covered or not permissible to look at. It's also advised to avoid taking pictures or videos during the acts of worship themselves unless there's a very compelling reason or a clear benefit in doing so. With regards to tawaf and sa'i, it's better to avoid riding on something, like riding on some type of device, unless there's a valid reason for the individual to do so. This would be in line with the view of the majority of scholars in this regard. Now, with regards to performing marriages via modern means of communication, doing so for marriage or the separation of a marriage is permissible as long as both sides, both parties can visually and orally communicate. The marriage contract done via telephone is valid if the two parties have already known each other and witnesses can hear their words, but it's preferable to have both audio and visual connection. Assigning a proxy to act on one's behalf is also allowed if one of the two parties is not able to attend. A marriage cannot occur, however, using emails or using voice messages that were recorded, because it's essential for the witnesses to be able to affirm both parties. Using a proxy is preferred to using a recorded message, such as an email or a voice message. When it comes to registering a marriage, this is not one of the essential components in Islam for the marriage to be valid. However, it's essential to protect the rights of both parties and prevent anyone from escaping their responsibility in case of disputes. Then it would be essential to record the marriage in that regard. Also, registering of marriages may be required by authorities, in which case Muslims should comply with such laws. Moving on, with regards to transporting the deceased and what may imply of disposing internal organs and the likes, the default is to bury the deceased in the land where they pass away, in a nearby cemetery. The body should not be transported to a distant land, even if the deceased left a will requesting that it should still not be done. The exception is if there's an overriding benefit in doing so, then it can be done with the condition that the body is not mutilated, that the internal organs and parts are removed for the purpose of transport, and that the expenses are covered by volunteering relatives, and that the heirs do not object to the transporting of the body. Lastly comes the issue of manufactured meats. Consumption of such meats that are manufactured is permissible if it comes from a permissible source. And the manufacturing process should not cause harm to the consumer. Medical sources have to be consulted to confirm, but the default ruling is that of permissibility. Now, manufactured meat is of two types. The first is one that is produced from animal stem cells, and this is still in the experimental stage and requires further research before a ruling can be made. The source of the stem cells has to be clarified, as well as knowing any additional materials that are added in the manufacturing process and what their health effects are on human beings. On a preliminary level, one may say the following, that there's no harm in it if there's no harm if it's manufactured from an animal that is permissible to slaughter. So if it's manufactured from an animal that's permissible to slaughter, then it is permissible, while not using the blood or serum in the manufacturing process. It's also to be noted that anything which is cut off from an animal, from a live animal, is considered carrion and cannot be used. The other type of manufactured meats is produced from vegetable sources, and these are permissible since the source itself is permissible. Similarly, and lastly, processed meats such as luncheon and other types take the same rulings as their source meats. Wallahu a'lam. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.